This is one of the reasons why I'm anti-Pomodoro technique, because it actually is antithetical to what we teach about flow state. So Pomodoro technique doesn't even give you a chance to reach that flow state. You're kind of just in this state of like panic all the time. So talk about like inducing that cortisol, right? I only have 20 minutes to do this thing. I better go fast, right? And then the timer goes off and you've got 5 minutes to do, I don't know what, and then you're back into it. Like that is so jarring.
Welcome back to the YouTube channel, or if you're listening on the podcast, welcome back to the podcast. My name is Jenna Redfield, and today we have a very special guest, Anna. She and I connected actually on TikTok, of all places, and I reached out and I said, hey, we have to do some sort of content together, and I invited her on. So welcome to the channel.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, so I found you, I don't know how I found you, maybe a year ago, 6 months ago, I don't remember, but I love your content because it talks all about different routines and different ways to kind of organize your brain and your life with ADHD or with whatever you're maybe struggling with, and kind of how to stay on track and stay on task. So can you kind of introduce yourself and kind of what you do for all the things that you're doing?
Yeah, so my name is Anna, and I now cover a whole bunch of different things, but I think it's probably most easily summarized as I work in kind of this little corner of the internet that we target productivity, but we do it through a lens of trying to create more holistic solutions and thinking about it through the lens of the human, not just productivity for the sake of productivity. And so I want to take an approach that is a little bit more grounded in mindfulness and of a lot of the principles that we learn about from Buddhism, and just really learning how to slow down the amount of information that's coming at us and target the way we want to live our lives and the values that we have through the lens of making sure that we are quiet enough and focused enough to really live our way into the type of person that we want to be. There's a wonderful quote that says that your habits are all about each action you take is a vote for the type of person that you want to become. And so much of that framing informs the work that I do. And yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure James Clear said that, because I'm pretty sure that's in Atomic Habits. And yeah. I think that all the stuff that you've been doing is so interesting, because I feel like you've created a lot yourself. How much of it is things that you've learned versus how much have you like created for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, so much of the work that I do now. So as both an artist, a content creator, a business owner, we can get into a little bit about the company that I started through all of this content that I was making. But so much of this came from my own desperation, my own need to create and discover solutions that worked for me. So I most specifically talk about executive dysfunction as an overarching principle, right? And so much of neurodivergence falls underneath that. But we also know that executive dysfunction can be brought on by a number of difficult circumstances in life too. So something like the last couple of years, right? Definitely a challenging experience that many people are experiencing executive dysfunction for the very first time in their life and going, what is happening? Why are these things that used to be so simple and easy for me to do? Why does it feel so challenging? And so I really want to target a lot of those things and say, okay, what's really going on here? And so much of the study that I do and the writing that I do and the content I create is by reading other people, reading a lot of neuroscientists and biologists, and not just the productivity experts, but there are some wonderful ones that we're starting to tease this apart as, oh, maybe all of this stuff that we've chalked up to kind of like moral attribution around productivity, maybe that's not really what's going on here. And it's time for us to drop that and really look at what's happening with the entire brain, with the entire human body, and how we function in a world that is constantly tugging at us to pay attention to something else.
Yeah. And so much, I have so many thoughts, because I'm like, I've been doing a lot of this research myself too. So I've been reading books, but one of the things I know that is a trigger for a lot of people is their phones, the technology piece. So I know that's like part of the problem, but it's also part of the solution. Can you kind of talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So I think One of the ways that I think about this, a lot of my work is now dipping into a lot of internet addiction, technology addiction, how we create boundaries with these things that we have to live with. Like there's so much that's contained in it, which for many people is a big, scary conversation that we are really uncomfortable having. But I think it's necessary for us because if we think about the internet, right? The internet's kind of in its teenage era. The internet, most of us, I'm guessing you and I both kind of grew up in the same experience of the internet where it's like, we kind of remember life without it, but increasingly as more newcomers come to this earth, right? Like they are not going to understand the difference between when anybody could reach you at any time versus maybe having the freedom to go about your day without having distractions constantly tugging at your attention. So yeah, it is definitely a huge issue and it's part of what I'm aiming at. But then also we have to understand that there's a lot of value in what we've created. And if we speak about social media specifically, media has a lot of value, right? It's a way that we share information. It's a way that we connect with people, right? You and I wouldn't be having this conversation if it weren't for social media. And yet, if we go back to that teenager metaphor, if we don't have boundaries or an understanding of how to have a better relationship with technology, it's going to run our lives. And so we're trying to figure out at this point, how do we live in harmony with technology, not having our lives run by? A lot of us are acting like social media and technology is something that's happening to us, not something that we can actually do something about it. And so I'm really interested in what are those small things that we can make, those small changes that we can begin to make in our everyday, how we move through our everyday. And maybe not so much, I think a lot of what's written about creating boundaries with social media is like, get a light phone, get off of all social media, like all of these really extreme and drastic measures. And for some people that is necessary and good, but it's not realistic for most of us. And it's also a very privileged perspective to think that we could just disconnect from everyone. And so again, going back to how do we live more in harmony with this, not in so much tension with it.
Yeah, and that's so true. I think one of the things that we've had to do for the last couple of years is technology was our way of connecting. And so you can't just take that away. But we have become so reliant on it as well. So it's kind of like we went from like somewhat addicted, but then during the pandemic, it was like it was our only way to communicate. So I think it made it worse. And I know it has affected mental health and all these things. But I think there is a balance of how much do we use it versus how much we don't use it, taking breaks versus, completely. I know like, what is it? Cal Newport always talks about like, don't use social media at all. And I'm like, yeah, but like, I'm a content creator, like I have to, and I have to know what's going on. And I think for you, one of the things that you've been focusing on is building like systems or what's kind of your solution for this problem? Like, what are you personally doing to put up boundaries for yourself, or what are you telling others to do as well?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to any of these things, so when we think about attention, focus, habits, building toward the kind of person we want to become, this is all about establishing what your routine is, what your system is, what your rhythm is. Like all of these things, we can use these words interchangeably, but they do all have subtle differentiation. So pick which one works for you. If you are somebody who I am good on a schedule, I need this structure, then great, build that around yourself. That's how I am. I know that if I have these really, I have these times that I drop into a state of deep work or a flow state, or going hiking to the same place every single week, like those things are really good for my brain. It helps to kind of absolve myself of that decision fatigue. The decision's already been made. This is the schedule I'm working on. Other people really respond to rhythms, right? So certain days of the week are more based around productivity, or certain days of the week are based around being a little bit more fluid and creative. So I think it really is, I think for anybody who identifies on the neurodivergent spectrum, I cannot emphasize enough how much curiosity matters. Like stay curious about what is working and what is not. It's something that we find with my company, Spacetime Monotasking, where we help people to create these intentional focused spaces. You'll see our comment sections on social media are filled with people immediately shutting it down, immediately deflecting, because I think those of us who struggle with this, right? Like we've tried a million things and it feels like nothing works. But I think that that's part of the creative process is remain curious because there is something, and it may not be the thing that works for you forever. I think that's the other part of it is like find what works for you right now in this season of life with all of the inputs and outputs that you have to manage. Find what works for you right now and don't worry about creating this perfect solution that will work forever because that's not realistic. And that's just kind of enabling some of this kicking the can down the road behavior that we're all really familiar with.
Yeah, I mean, I have so many thoughts because it's like this is stuff that I think about on a daily basis. Like, first of all, how much am I consuming to like learn a system, or am I trying it for myself or trying to make my own system? Because people are like, you should do this, you should do this, you should time block, you should, do the Pomodoro method. There's all of these different like ways to structure either your time or your energy, which is another thing that we don't talk about is like, I go into the day not knowing where my energy is going to be. Am I going to just want to chill, or am I like, ooh, I'm really productive? And sometimes you don't know in advance. And that's the one thing about, the neurodiverse community is like going into the day, I have no idea. I could have a general idea, but like if my energy is not there, I can't figure it out. And I don't know if it was you or somebody else mentioned like different types of activities for different types of like energies, and like figuring out like, oh, there's like a general list of ideas that I could do for today, and then picking one depending on how. I've seen that before on TikTok where people are like, I have a list of like 30 things I need to do. Depending on like my mood, I'll pick one of them. As long as I get one done, that's a good thing. I mean, there's so many different types of systems. Can you kind of maybe explain some of the ones you've seen or ones that you have recommended to people?
Yeah, definitely. So one of the biggest ones that we recommend, it's a formula that I developed and now we disseminate through my company, Spacetime, is this idea of a flow state formula. So I think in this world, one of the things that will prevent us from making the progress we need to make, from taking the big action that we need to take, is our biggest hurdle is distraction. If we can protect our attention is both valuable and it is vulnerable. And so we need to protect it fiercely if we want to do the shit in this world that we want to do, right? I think about it like we have so much big stuff to accomplish. And if we don't learn how to value our attention the way it deserves to be valued, then it's not going to get done. It's just not. And so I think it's important for us to really protect that as a resource, whatever it takes. So if it is having a list of low energy activities, my co-founder actually does a lot of this kind of stuff where she evaluates based on like, okay, this is a low energy task I can do today versus a high energy task. I personally prefer to just work in these very focused blocks and lower the expectation of myself. So whatever gets done, and understanding it more in the process of like, this is a bigger creative process. The type of work I do is very knowledge work. And so if I'm working on a book or I'm working on a painting or building out something that requires some really intense focus, I want to block off and create these distraction-free zones where I can drop into a flow state. And if you're not familiar with the terminology of flow state, this is a researched psychological state that we can get ourselves into when we're in this perfect sweet spot of being challenged, but not too challenged, of really like being in this place of you're creating and you don't have all of that self-criticism, or at least it kind of like fades to the background a little bit and you're just kind of in it, you're doing it and it feels really good and you have a good momentum. And so I'm always looking for that. And I don't achieve it all the time, but in kind of prioritizing my attention as the number one thing, that is what helps me to achieve my flow state. So I don't worry as much about my high energy versus low energy tasks. I think more about my time in terms of how much can I dedicate my attention to something. And so if it's a big scary task, maybe I don't expect so much of myself and I try to only get into like a 30 minutes or 1 hour of giving my attention to that thing. But I think more about it as like the distribution of this resource that I have in whatever way makes the most sense in terms of what needs to happen, how much time I have to give it. So yeah, I mean, there's a million systems, but I think maybe to use an example that most people will be familiar with, like a Notion template, right? I sell a
Mhm.
Notion template, but I don't expect that everything on that Notion template is going to work for everybody. However, what my intention is on part of that template is to help people think about what would happen if you only expected yourself to do one thing an hour. That was a philosophy that transformed my life. It's what gave life to everything that I'm doing now, to say, okay, so at 8 o'clock, my only expectation is to feed and walk my dog. At 9 o'clock, my only expectation is to answer emails. At 10 o'clock, I have a meeting, a phone call with somebody. And really to think about my time in terms of that. And what I found was counterintuitively, lowering my expectation of myself allowed me to do things more thoroughly, more completely, more, I mean, it's kind of a cheesy word to say, but like more joyfully, right? I was more present in it. I wasn't so distracted about how am I going to fit it all in. It was like, no, this is my only expectation of myself. It's just this one thing for this 1 hour. So, yeah, so to go back to it, like no one thing is going to work for everybody, but I think finding a way to prioritize your flow state, and we do have a flow state formula that I'd be happy to share with everybody. But this is kind of like a principle of this company, is to really value your attention as that resource.
Yeah, because that's a hard thing to do. But in this world right now, where there's a million different notifications and there's all these different things that are taking our energy and our attention. What I know that your company is about monotasking. So like focus, I mean, that word basically means it's the opposite of multitasking, right? So it's like doing one thing at a time. Can you kind of explain like what that means and like how you kind of came with that to the company?
Yeah, so let's talk about the myth of multitasking, right? Most of us think that multitasking, it kind of is this productivity beard that we wear. It makes us feel really busy and important when we've got a whole lot of, like, we're juggling. But what's really happening is we're actually switching tasks really rapidly and doing everything very ineffectively. There's a ton of research to back this up right now. And I think it's really, really fascinating, right? So a couple of things are happening, right? When you're multitasking, it's been found to increase your cortisol, which is your stress hormone. It's been found to increase your adrenaline, which is your fight, flight, freeze, and fawn response, right? So it's activating all of these like stress hormones inside of you. It also, multitasking, I think this is the craziest one of all, is that multitasking creates this dopamine feedback loop for you that rewards the brain for losing focus.
Mm.
So you're basically counteracting the thing that you think you're doing. You think, I'm multitasking, I'm holding all of these things at once. But what you're actually doing is like everything is slipping through your fingers simultaneously. And your brain is creating this feedback loop to say, no, 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 but look at me, I'm holding all of this stuff. But how well are you holding it is the real question. And so I started this exploration. This goes back to like the one thing an hour situation, is I wanted to see what would happen if I got a little bit more concentrated, got a little bit more focused on the thing that was in front of me. And so monotasking obviously exists in opposition to multitasking, but monotasking really requires us to pare down things into what really matters. So a big part of this, and I can kind of walk through the flow state formula, this is kind of where it all comes into action, is about basically creating an environment in which you can be fully immersed in the thing that's in front of you. And so this is a lot like meditation, right? Which a lot of people in ADHD specifically, but any like neurodivergent struggles with attention or executive dysfunction, right? It's so deeply uncomfortable, right? So I'm not going to tell you that monotasking is the most, like, at first anyway, it'll feel very deeply uncomfortable because our bodies are so used to this cortisol dump that we experience every time we're trying to multitask. So it does require some training. It requires a lot of patience, a lot of compassion. There's a lot of like really beautiful qualities that you get to cultivate when you practice this. And so for me, this all started because I said to myself, what would happen if I gave myself 1 hour a week of judgment-free creative focus time? And so it would just be 1 hour where my phone would be out of reach. I would put on my headphones, I would put on a good playlist, I would light a candle, and I would just try to make whatever felt right to me. And so that led to a deepening of my creative practice. It led to me really realizing and defining my artistic style through just this 1 hour a week of doing this. And what was cool about it was I got to see how often my self-judgment, my self-criticism, my self-doubt was just leaping in there, just left and right, telling me why I needed to stop, telling me why it wasn't sufficient, telling me why I'm not a good artist, all of those things. And I get a chance to say, like, hang on, I said I was leaving all of this stuff out of this hour for just an hour. Can I just be nice to myself, really? So that's a very long explanation and probably not what most people would tell you about monotasking, but I think it is this really incredible opportunity for us to build self-trust, to build self-confidence, and to really build a framework around our lives that values ourselves in a totally different way. That says everybody who might need me during this time that I've blocked off is going to have to wait because this is my time. And I think there's something really beautiful in repeating that action over and over and over again, is that you really get to see yourself differently through doing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so interesting. And I think you're so right of like making space for yourself to be creative and have play. I've been reading about the, how to be creative and all those different studies that have been coming out. I'm actually curious, what tools do you use to, I guess maybe avoid distractions or notifications? Do you have any hacks for that to like keep in that state? I don't know what tech you use. I know you mentioned some of that on your TikTok. Like, what are some of your favorite tools to kind of organize your thoughts and just organize your time?
Yeah, so number one, do not disturb mode. If you're not using do not disturb mode, make it your best friend because it is really powerful. And I actually have, if you have an iPhone, this is a really cool thing that I've done is you can set up a type of do not disturb mode. And I have one that I've created that is flow state. And it's no different in terms of like what happens on the other end. It's like no text, I don't get any notifications, right? So all notifications just go to pause. And it's exactly like any other do not disturb mode, but it's in the action of me clicking that I'm going into my flow state mode that my brain goes, okay, everybody else is going to have to wait. And so I think it's really important to kind of give your brain those cues that like, okay, now is the time. It's not time to go on TikTok. It's time to be with my art process. But the biggest one is going to be your phone. Find a place for your phone to live so that it's not even on your desk. There's this crazy research about how even the mere presence, the visibility of your phone will knock your attention off course. It's like even just knowing that it's there and not even looking at it, just knowing that it's there has an effect on your ability to focus. And so I have a few different areas of my home where my phone goes to live when it's time to focus. And so I like to use over-the-ear headphones to either plug into a playlist through my computer, or sometimes I'll even do it on my phone if I know it's not going to be a kind of playlist where I'm going to want to skip a lot of songs. So I'll do it through my phone and then put my phone away so that I'm just fully immersed in my zone. But I think really there's boxes out there, timer boxes that you could put your phone in and set a timer to not look at it. But I think the biggest thing is finding a way to just disconnect from that. My favorite thing to do when I don't need to be responsible to anybody is to turn it off, like off. And that makes people so wildly uncomfortable, but I cannot tell you the freedom of hitting that power button. And like, you can take a deep breath for the first time in years if you do that.
Yeah.
Really incredible. And, I started doing that on Friday nights when I knew I wouldn't need an alarm on Saturday morning. Just Friday night, the phone goes off and I'll still watch a movie or hang out with a friend, but it's off. And waking up on Saturday morning knowing that my phone is off is like, oh my God, it's this beautiful just energy of, I don't know, it's like you really can actually take a deep breath.
Yeah, I think
So,
definitely,
I think the biggest is really just you got to find a way to put a wall between you and your phone.
yeah, I try to do like timer limits for apps. I don't know if you've done that as well. Just
Well,
okay. So yeah, it's very hard. Like TikTok is the one I try. I do like a 15-minute and then it's like, you're done. And then I'm like, oh, another 15 minutes. Like it's hard for me. I try to do it, but whether or not I actually follow through on my intentions is another thing. But so can you tell us a little bit more about your company? Cause I know you do a lot of stuff with like body doubling and different things. So can you kind of explain a little bit what you guys do?
yeah, definitely. So my company's called Spacetime Monotasking, and we operate like a virtual co-working space. So if you think about the way a fitness studio is set up, you buy a membership and then you can book your classes and go to those classes. So we're doing that same business model, but we're doing it with these focused spaces that are happening over Zoom. So the way it works is if you book a session, you can do a one-off session, or you can get a membership to come to as many as you want to. These Zoom rooms, will open them up. There's always a host who encourages people to set an intention, go on do not disturb mode, put phone out of reach if you can, like to do all of these ritual things. And then we set an intention for the time. So we work in 1 hour sprints and 2 hour flows. And the only difference between them is that the 2 hour flow really gives you a chance to go deep with something in a way that the 1 hour sprint isn't. So the way we talk about it is like the 1 hour sprint is good for like the, answering emails or even just testing out what it feels like to be in a flow state. It usually takes about 20 to 30 minutes for your brain for your brain and your body to like get on the same page so that you can actually get into a flow state. So this is one of the reasons why I'm anti-Pomodoro technique, because it actually is antithetical to what we teach about flow state. So Pomodoro technique doesn't even give you a chance to reach that flow state. You're kind of just in this state of like panic all the time. So talk about like inducing that cortisol, right? I only have 20 minutes to do this thing. I better go fast, right? And then the timer goes off and you've got 5 minutes to do, I don't know what, and then you're back into it. Like that is so jarring for a lot of people's brains that we find there's a whole lot more contained within giving yourself a longer runway. Basically, give yourself those first 20 minutes just to get everything settled, right? Everything calm, everything present. And then you can get into your flow state. It kind of just takes over from there if you give yourself the runway. So back to space time. So we create these 1 and 2 hour sessions that are kind of designed around that, right? How can we help you create the space and time that you've been saying you want to? And so I think for a lot of people, it helps them with managing what's like the flow of work coming in. It's helping manage projects. I was chronically in my career starting projects and not finishing them, or really struggling to follow through on things and really feeling badly about myself because of all of that stuff. And the truth was, I just was working in these chaotic, distracting work environments, and I needed to find ways to focus and kind of power down the outside world so I could just be with the thing. So that's really our goal right now as a company, is to create these places where you can actually focus and you can be really present, and you can do it in the company of other people. Because if you're on a Zoom call and there's 5 other people there who also showed up to do whatever they were going to do, you're less likely to walk away from that project because you've got the accountability, you made the intention, you showed up for the Zoom call. And so why not just be here and be with it? So I always like to do a checkout at the end as well. These Zoom calls happen completely in silence too. You can go video on or video off. We try to make it as an accommodating of a space as we possibly can, because we understand there's so many different factors for people when it comes to creating those focus spaces. And so our goal is to just say like, hey, we're here. If you want to show up and work with us, like that's what we're going to be doing. And if not, like that's fine. And so we're also creating a lot of other solutions around that based on the feedback we're getting from our members. But it's just been a really amazing thing to start this. This happened from a viral TikTok video I made about monotasking. And then I decided to start a Patreon, and then a whole bunch of people joined the Patreon. And I realized, oh, I have an entire background of business operations for startups. Why don't I take this seriously and figure out, could this actually be something? And so over the last year, we've just really been building it and are really excited to create more memberships and more offerings for people, and really just to target this thing that I think it really has the chance to change people's lives.
Yeah, I love that you took this idea that obviously people are interested in from TikTok and turned it into a business. Cause I feel like I did the same thing with the ADHD Notion, everything. It's like finding out all this stuff and being like, oh my gosh, there's so many people that want both of these things. And I think, we have so much in common, I feel like with all the different ways we use social and just like all these different topics. And I'm very inspired by people that actually take action on the things that people are obviously struggling with, and you want a solution. And I think you've made something that people are obviously wanting. And I think that is always so cool to see. So with some of that, I'm curious, you talk a little bit about, figuring out the best way to make you thrive. What are some of those other ways to prioritize yourself, like meditation you've mentioned? Can you also explain? I think some people don't understand what meditation is or mindfulness. I know they're different. Can you kind of walk through some of those for us?
Yeah, so meditation would be something that's considered within mindfulness. So let's talk about mindfulness as kind of an overarching thing, is anything where you're really present in your experience. And if you think about that, like I know for myself, slowing down felt like the most impossible, improbable thing that I could ever do. And now I see it as the biggest red flag in myself that I needed to do it. And I have this conversation with people all the time, like I have ADHD, I can't focus. And I'm like, honestly, learning how to meditate, learning how to sit quietly with my own brain for 5 or 10 minutes is the most powerful thing I ever did for my ADHD, for my executive dysfunction. It's like basically when you meditate, the reason why you do it is to train your body to be inside of something uncomfortable, to be inside of an uncomfortable experience, to witness that it's uncomfortable, to try to learn how to not judge yourself about the fact that it's uncomfortable, and to just release, right? Release the expectation. So I could talk about that forever, but I think all of this stuff kind of that description I gave, like that's always kind of what we're going for when we're talking about mindfulness, is like how can you be really present and non-judgmental and compassionate toward yourself in the experience. And I'll give an example actually. I was at there's a really cool organization that I go to their events. Sometimes they do these listening hours where the goal of these events is that you sit in a room with a whole bunch of other people and they play these records on this hi-fi listening system, and you just sit there and you listen, and people don't have their phones out, they're not texting their friends, everybody's just listening to the music. And so I went to one of these events one time and I found myself just closing my eyes and taking a deep breath, and I thought to myself, I'm content right now. And I went, holy shit, I have never felt contentment in my entire life, like ever, ever, ever. But it's been years of training myself just to be right here. Like this moment, Anna and Jenna talking on this call will never exist again. This will never happen again. We might do another call again, but it will never be this one. And so I think it shifts your perspective on like, wow, life goes really fast, but it can also be a really long time if you're anchored into what's actually happening around you. And so all of this has like huge implications for how we think about how we use our time, who we spend it with, all of these broader existential questions. But I think when it comes to the productivity space, like this is an area where we are severely lacking because we're just trying to maximize everything. And we're thinking about quantity. We're not thinking about quality. If we really want to make the changes we need to make in this world, we have to start thinking about quality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It was so funny. I had this conversation yesterday. I was reading a book and it was a fiction book. And I haven't read a fiction book in like years because I'm like, to me, I'm like, I'd rather be spending my time reading something that will help my brain. And I felt guilty. I was like, oh, this is going to take forever to read this book. Like, I want to read it. I like mentally, I want to read it. But I'm like, the time it takes. And then I just felt like this weird sense of like, oh, I should be constantly improving. So it's like, maybe I'm just in that mindset of like, I have to always be moving forward versus just sitting in it and just allowing myself to be entertained without the need to actually, I guess, be productive. So I don't know if that's like another thing too. It's almost like anti-productivity, right? So it's kind of like, can we be, because like that's the other thing, there's the hustle culture, there's like, it's like you have to be constantly, spending all your time on the right thing. But then I think what you're saying is like, don't do that, right? Like figure out like a way to just be content and take a step back and not have the time be totally perfect and what you have to do.
Yeah, I mean, the time will never be perfect. I think that's been something that's been really powerful for me, is realizing like, oh, I'm constantly aiming at a moving target when I'm looking for perfection or when I'm looking to maximize something. Or there's this brilliant psychological differentiation. I'm blanking on who the researchers were, but they created these terms called maximizers and satisficers. And so it's not like you're just one type of person and you're always that type of person. It's like, no, in every context, you're kind of like fluidly switching between, am I trying to maximize this situation? Or am I somebody who looks at the situation and says, this is enough, that's a satisficer, I'm satisfied. So I'm really more interested in how do I move from being a maximizer all the time into being more of a satisficer, because I'm trying to, at everything I'm doing, I'm trying to rebalance, right? Because I think the broader context of productivity is like, it's very heavily weighted on this like militant, very masculine energy, this very push, go harder, faster, stronger. When the reality is like nothing good ever came from forcing something to happen. And so how can we maybe release a little bit? Maybe how can we slow down a little bit? How can we receive a little bit more? How can we get into this more fluid state? And I think your example of sitting down to read a fiction book is a beautiful example of how dare we think we couldn't get inspiration or motivation from something that we enjoy, right? There might be something in the action of sitting down to read your fiction book that could inspire something weeks down the road or years down the road. You never know. And so we rush to these snap judgments about what is valuable and what is not, rather than taking the perspective. And this is how I think about all of life, is it's all just one big creative process. And if we're anchored into the fact that it's a creative process, then we're constantly learning, we're constantly iterating. There is no end to it. The end is when we die. But if I think about my life as this big creative process, then I can kind of stop forcing everything to happen and just trust that whatever rises to the surface is good and valuable and worth pursuing.
Yeah, that's such a good way to put it, because I love the idea of the maximizers versus the satisficers. I think that is something we are constantly battling, like reading online, like, oh, you should be doing this, you should be doing this, versus like we never talk about, oh, it's fine to just be content. It's fine to just not push the boundaries all the time forever. And I know that you call it gentle productivity too. That's the name of what you kind of call it? Or is that something you came up with, or did you learn that from somewhere?
Yeah, I think I came up with it. I guess there's probably other people. Nothing exists in a vacuum, right? And so I don't want to like put claim to it. I don't have a trademark on the name, but it is something that I thought a lot about. I actually resisted the language of productivity for the first year that I was talking about what I was talking about, because I think I was so burned by hustle and the productivity culture that I knew of. But then once I realized like, oh, actually productivity does feel good, and it feels good for a number of really important reasons, because to be in action, to be in creativity, to be building, collaborating, making, that's how the human species survived. Like we wouldn't have done that. And so if we hadn't had that mentality. And so I think it's really important to value it for what it is. I think we resist productivity culture, but it's not productivity that we should be fighting against. We should be learning how to work with ourselves, not against ourselves. And so a lot of what you'll hear out there is not grounded in reality of how life works, of how humans work. And so if we take a more gentle approach to it, and we look at all of this stuff through the lens of mindfulness, of monotasking, of movement, of thinking about how we can engage with our entire self in the process of creation, then we're not so beholden to these input output expectations, which aren't real, by the way. The whole idea, and I think that's what a lot of productivity is based around, right? If you put in these inputs, you will get these outputs. And it doesn't actually work like that. Sometimes it does, often it does, but over a long period of time, right? I think that's another James Clear thing. Like you fix the inputs and the outputs will fix themselves, but there is no clear timeline. It's not like you just do this one thing and immediately the result will change. So this is more about like taking the longer view. That's why I think thinking about life as a creative process is so powerful, is it forces you to take the longer view.
Mm-hmm. Another thing I've been reading a lot about is like compounding, where it doesn't actually happen right away, but it starts to go faster and faster, which is like, but you have to wait through the time when it doesn't happen. So I think like a lot of us, and that just doesn't work with time of humans, right? Like compounding isn't how real time works, but like the effort and the results they do go like this. So it's like, I think that for us, we have to kind of just always think about that side of it too. It's like you might put in a little bit of effort, maybe immediately you'll get little bit of results, but maybe it might take some time. So it's like you kind of have to be patient. And I think just keep doing what you're doing to get that payout. And I think that we don't talk about that enough, because I think that's just how the world works. Like if you think about compound interest, when you think about anything, it just takes time. And I think patience is something a lot of us also struggle with, is like, we want it now. Our brain is like so used to getting everything now. Like our Amazon packages can come in like 2 days. Like I think we as a society have forgotten how to be patient. And I think that that is a struggle that a lot of us have. I don't know if that's something you struggle with as well.
Oh, absolutely. I actually think one of the most powerful things in this entire conversation for me to explore, investigate, learn about, and I would encourage anybody who's inspired listening to this conversation to start looking into how did the human species survive?
Mm,
Because you learn a lot about what your body is doing very naturally that does not actually serve you in the modern world, but our bodies haven't necessarily evolved to match the cultural expectation or the technology or all of that stuff. Like I think learning about things um like how things compound, right? So things take some time, right? Our brains are not wired to think about the long-term reward. They're wired to survive. So they're wired to do whatever it takes to get out of the uncomfortable situation as quickly as possible, right? Because we got to survive, we got to procreate, we got to keep the species alive. But when we're talking about this broader conversation of doing things over a sustainable period, right? That's not a conversation about survival. That's a conversation about creativity. That's a conversation about thriving. That's not a conversation about surviving. And so it requires us to take that longer picture view to understand how much patience is a huge, like probably one of the most important, patience and creativity, right? If you can cultivate those two things, your life will totally change. You will become unrecognizable to yourself if you can cultivate those two things.
yeah, I was literally just reading a book. It's called The Science of Stuck. It's definitely my favorite book I've read this year. And it, like what you just said, your brain's primary function is to keep you alive, not to make you happy. And I think you're right. That's that evolution of like, we as a society are alive and we have been thriving for a long time, but our brains are still kind of primitive in the way where we're still trying to survive. But we're at this point where we can go beyond that and thrive and be happy. So but we're not used to that as a society. Like for hundreds and hundreds of, like, even just our ancestors, they all struggled so much more than we did, and we struggle in a different way. But like I mean, most of us are able to be okay right now. Like there's not as many things that are literally killing us like they used to be, wars and famines, and like especially us in first world countries. Like it's a different world. But I think that's so fascinating to me. Yeah, is there any books or any resources on like learning about the history of humankind that you would recommend, or anything that we should check out?
Yeah, so number one is Sapiens. That's a
Okay.
phenomenal one. There's also a documentary series, I guess you would call it that. It's a science documentary series that I've been watching for as long as I can remember. You can get it through pbs.com. It's called Nova. And they do a lot of really interesting, like 60-minute, maybe even less, maybe even shorter documentaries about all sorts of things. The ones about space are fascinating, but the ones about early humans I find to be extraordinarily fascinating, because you just get to learn like, wow, these people, like, they weren't ever going to be thinking about the types of things that we're thinking about today, because they had to survive, because it was a real thing that a lion might eat you tomorrow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's crazy how like much a lot of our fear and trauma responses are still in us when that threat is gone, but then now there's different threats, and it's crazy. I think yeah, this is all fascinating to me. I know we could probably go on forever on this tangent. But I do want to kind of end with how do we get in touch with you? How do we follow you on social media? I know we've talked about social media, but like obviously we want to still see your content. How do we connect with you after this conversation?
Yeah, so this is one of the reasons why I do love social media and why I don't ever anticipate that I will get off of it altogether, because I love being able to exchange ideas with people, right? So definitely give me a follow if you're on TikTok. I am at Anna's in Wonderland over there. And then also check out, if you're on TikTok, check out Spacetime Monotasking. My co-founder does all of the content over there. She does a phenomenal job with it. But then you can also check us out at spacetimemonotasking.com just to learn a little bit more about us. I'm also going to do a plug for our newsletter, which we started a couple of months ago. It's called The Portal. And every week, my co founder and I put together ideas all around everything we've been talking about today and more, just to really try to help people think a little bit more open minded about how we can navigate this crazy, distracted world that we're living in, and how we can do it in a way that feels more sustainable, more balanced, more present. And so, yeah, I'm really excited about the things that we're doing over there. We're getting a blog together to be able to share some of those ideas that you can trade around with each other. But yeah, we're really excited to be in this space that I think the world really needs right now. I think we're all really desperate. We're feeling really burned out and we're asking ourselves why. And a lot of the reason is right in the palm of your hands.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that that's really great. I definitely need to do more writing as well. Like I feel like I have so many thoughts in my head, and I love the idea of having that weekly or monthly newsletter and having a blog and all that stuff. I think there's just so much that I feel like we all probably have this collective knowledge and just need to share more. And that is why social media is helpful. I think TikTok I've learned so much on there, and I think it's a great platform. And I think you have to kind of find your people, but like I think it's honestly super informative, and I've definitely gotten some amazing things that I've learned from there. So I hope everyone checks her out, Anna's in Wonderland on TikTok. But thank you so much for joining us. And maybe if there's more questions, maybe we'll do a part 2 in the future. But this was super fun. So thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much.